What's up, guys? It's Negative, and this video is about the Hori GameCube controller. It's a third-party GameCube controller made by Hori, but you can tell that it also says Nintendo GameCube and has the official GameCube logo and text underneath, which is kind of surprising, right, for something that's not made by Nintendo that they allowed them to put that on the controller. And yet, having something like that on it means, unsurprisingly, it does feel like an official controller as far as the sturdiness of the build. It doesn't feel cheap or flimsy. The control stick feels very accurate. In fact, I think it is an OEM stick box from standard GameCube controller types. However, the first thing I noticed when I picked it up is that the stick cap that it had, it kind of caught friction on the bottom edge. You see, here's the stick box that it came with, or the stick cap, sorry, and here's the ones for like a traditional GameCube controller. They look very similar. The coloration's slightly different, and it's a little more glossy. It turns out that it was catching friction, or it felt like there was more friction when you rolled it around underneath the faceplate. So I swapped that out for a different stick cap, and now it feels great. Specifically, I grabbed one from a Wii Classic controller. They look like this. Because those stick boxes, the caps for them, they stick up a little higher, and it makes it easier to do like pivot up tilts since you you essentially push your thumb the same distance, but the stick travels a little farther. So it's just a little bit easier to do pivot up tilt stuff with it. So I decided to go with one of those. Other than that, though, there were some key differences between this controller and the GameCube controller. Let's talk about the buttons. So at first, the most minor of these things is that the C stick, the C actually points in the wrong direction. It's pointing this way. The way that they mount everything up inside there and the way that the cutout is on the wrong side, essentially the way the stick cap fits on there makes it to where the C is going to point in the wrong direction. So it's a very small aesthetic change, but it is there. It's kind of a little weird, but doesn't really matter. The next thing that we got here is our A, B, X, and Y buttons and our start button. The start button is a nice big fat start button, right? And it's nice and rounded. Feels pretty good to press. But there's enough space in the controller here that you still probably shouldn't worry about accidentally pressing it. So that's fine. Now, our the B button is definitely the biggest difference here. Like, look at how large this B button is compared to like your traditional B button on a standard GameCube controller. It's much larger in diameter. And it's actually, once again, it has a very nice rounded face. It feels really, really good to use. And it sits up, decently high off of the controller, as you can see from the bottom side. Whereas on the top side, like where this raised, like circular rim is, it's roughly flush, slightly raised above it, right? And so it's actually just really nice. When you're sliding from Y to B to do like multi-shine type stuff, um, the way that your thumb travels to it's just that much easier to hit, and it feels really good. But the Y and X buttons themselves are also narrower, right? I don't know if you can see that, but the narrowness of these two buttons, they do feel good to press still. However, when you're sliding off this part of Y, it makes the angle just a little bit more extreme. And so what that does is it essentially makes it to where when you're doing this motion, if you do it too much, you might start to develop a blister on the bottom of your finger. And so you don't want to do that. But other than that, we've got a difference with the A button. The A button is also a little bit smaller in diameter. However, the A button, that makes it a little less, it makes it a little less often that you'll accidentally hit the A button when trying to swipe from Y to B, for example. It used to be that like this part of the thumb might accidentally contact A when you do those types of motions. And so that kind of reduces that risk. Additionally, there's another difference with the contact pads for these, and I'll talk about that in a second. But lastly, we have the D-pad over here. The D-pad kind of has rounded edges. It has a nice soft feel to them. So I haven't used it extensively, but the sharpness of the corners on the other D-pad for the typical GameCube controller can sometimes really give you blisters if you use that way too much. I don't foresee that being an issue for most melee players, right? Unless you're mashing up, taunting so much that you give yourself a blister. In that case, you can probably just die and no one will care. But for everyone else, not really going to be a problem. But lastly, the big thing on this controller, the reason why I bought one is because on this side you can see there are two Z buttons. So you've got a Z button on this side and a Z button on this side. And that's actually pretty cool. Essentially, what you can do is you can have them mapped so that you can, like, a lot of people will remap their Z button to be, let's say, jump, so that they don't have to like claw, and it makes doing the claw a little easier if they can make this jump and then have, let's say, X be grab. But then that makes jump cancel grabs and some other motions kind of awkward. And so if this is jump, well, now jump cancel grab could just be this, right? Ba 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 ba, like that. So for those types of setups, this is going to lend itself well to that. Additionally, if you were going to do an L cancel and you wanted to just input two L cancels, and they're both soft L cancels, you can. You can just did it like that. So it'll make you twice as likely to hit the L cancel if you're contacting a shield, because you can use slightly different timings. And then similarly, if you were going to do like a shield grab, right? So let's say you're shielding and you get, like, someone hits your shield, right? So you're in shield stun. Then you can just go like this and stagger the presses. And maybe this one was too early, it didn't grab, but then this one was, on time. So you get the grab for that. So that would be nice. And then there's one last thing that really stands out, which is the controller itself. The wings on this controller are kind of flared out at an angle, and the original GameCube controller, they're more parallel. So like your hands, instead of being outward like this, are more inward like this. And I feel like this is a more natural angle for playing. It feels pretty good to hold the controller. So I think that, that's fine. It's not a real big change, but it does feel good in the hands. And lastly, the let's talk about the contacts underneath uh, these buttons. So A and B kind of felt mushy when I first got the controller, so I decided to switch the contacts out for those. B was actually kind of fine, so I decided really at the end of the day I only wanted to switch out A. Initially, I swapped the contact that in the Hori out for a traditional GameCube button contact, but it turns out the Hori ones, they're very narrow and they're very tall. And so they actually fit up inside the button. Like there's like a little hole in the bottom of the buttons like this that the contact fits up into, and it holds it in place so it always stays centered under the button, which is kind of nice. That way the buttons don't feel like they wobble around when you press them as much. But at the same time, the actuation distance is a little bit lower than your typical. It's like a shorter actuation distance than your typical GameCube controller contact. So I wanted it to feel a little snappier. So maybe I wanted a contact that was raised up a little bit more. What I decided to go with is the contacts from a start button on your typical GameCube controllers. It's actually, it doesn't sit quite as high as this, which is good because when you actually tighten up the screws on the GameCube controller, it was kind of sandwiching the contact and pressing it together to where the contact was like already pressed. It basically pressed the button already. So like when I tried it on A, B, X, and Y, X was like always depressed. And then it turns out when I tried it for just A and B, that if I squeezed the controller, that it would depress the button. So I could actually do what they call single button multi actuation, which is where I can press the button to do this to jab, or I can actually pinch the controller either here or here, and like this, squeezing it with this part of the hand, and it would actuate jab as well. And you could use that to do like a short hop nair, let's say, and have it like really fast. But it turns out there's a much better method than that. Using the start button, like the contact for the start buttons for a normal GameCube controller, it actually sits lower than these, right? And so what happens is if you take a look at my A button, you'll notice my A button is sitting very flush to the surface of this natural curvature of the case. So the nice part about having your X and Y be taller and your A button be shorter, more flush to the surface, is that the height gap between the buttons allows you to flick off of Y and down towards A, and you can actually end up pressing A late enough that you can get like a short hop rising nair with Fox and Sheik and the other people with 3-frame jump squats. So essentially your short hop rising nair is as simple as going like that. It's very easy and very convenient, right? Because now you don't have to do any kind of wonky shit in order to do a nice short hop rising nair, and it leaves you free to just do, fade back on it or whatever you want to do. So that's a pretty nice um, bonus on top of the rest of the buttons, especially when like I'm doing multi-shine stuff or whatever else. When I flick from Y to B, I never have to worry about brushing up against A. If I'm doing, any kind of like shenanigans with C-stick and jumping and stuff, I'll never accidentally hit the A button. So that overall, that's a nice change. And yeah, that's about it, guys. Those are all the differences between the GameCube controller and the Hori. I think that there's a lot of potential here for the fact that it has 2 Z buttons. Especially, I don't think that remapping one of the Z's to be something else and then keeping the left button to be Z is actually optimal. I think in the future, what we want to have are GameCube controllers like this. GameCube controllers that have another button on the left-hand side. And what we can do with it is that it allows us to maybe make this a tilt modifier, which is like what a box type controller would have. Essentially, you can do full tilt with the analog, and depending on what angle you're holding, different regions will give you different tilts, right? So up would give you just up tilt, down would give you down tilt. Then you maybe have like straight sideways for the forward tilts. And then from there, also have like angled downward, maybe like perfect wave dashes, Firefox notches, you name it. And all of those things can be accessible and reliable with the press of only a single button. So that would be pretty dope for, discussion of future controller types. Other than that, these Z buttons feel amazing. They're actually a bit wider than your typical Z button, so it feels really good when you're resting your finger on them. And additionally, they have a tactile press. So if you listen here, I don't know if you can hear that, but they have a nice click. It's almost like a mouse button style click. And so, yeah, they feel amazing to use. And yeah, that's the controller. Pretty cool. Comes with Rumble. I don't use Rumble, so it doesn't matter to me. Didn't check out any difference between how it feels versus the official, but I wouldn't be able to tell you because I don't know how strong the Rumble is for those either. But that's the stick. Pretty cool. Maybe a couple of you guys will pick it up, try it out for Smash. And yeah, see you guys in the next video. Peace.